Hello guys, and welcome back to the History and Politics Vault with me, Ryan Gladman. Today is episode 3, I believe, of the Cold War series, the Gcse 9-1 Edexcel syllabus called Superpower, Relations and the Cold War. Further information for this Cold War topic, the Cold War book by John Lewis Gaddis is a very, very good source of information offering different interpretations and both sides analysis from the Soviet Union perspective and the US perspective. It's got lots of images and different chapters analysing the political impacts, the really far away foreign impacts in other countries, and also the domestic impacts that the Cold War had on both countries in particular. So I would recommend reading that. It's only £10 on Amazon. So if you are interested, have a look at that in your spare time. But anyway, today is the episode 3. I hope you are all okay in this COVID-19 situation. Keep safe. But for today's video, we're going to be looking at how the early tensions that we talked about in the last video have impacted the laws that these countries are starting to make. For example, the law which was made by the US in 1947 was called the Truman Doctrine, and it was named after President Truman, and it was in response to the US belief that the communist strategy used by the Soviet Union was expanding too quickly and communism was going to damage the economies of many Eastern European countries. And actually Britain got involved because early in 1947 they told the US that they could not financially support countries like Greece and Turkey anymore. So the US intervened and helped these countries by promising they would support them financially to recover their countries after World War II and also to defend themselves against the Soviet Union who are trying to expand their influence. So the Truman Doctrine is specifically for those countries, but the first country that it helps is Greece, and the Greek government was actually able to defeat communism, which had already started to spread its influence in the country. And once again, this showed that the US was far, far more of a European power than it had been in previous decades. It was intervening in lots of European affairs which it had not done, and this was a really big sign for a lot of European countries to understand that there is going to be other continental structure of power that is going to be involved in diplomatic affairs following World War II, and this movement towards a more inclusive globe and not just a European continent annoyed the Soviet Union because they wanted to grow themselves as a global power within Europe, and they had a rival at last, and that's how, like we have established before, that's how the two rivalries started, and that's why the Cold War started. So yes, the Truman Doctrine was given in a speech by Truman, and this came along with the Marshall Plan, which was introduced in 1947 as well, and it was designed, as we said before, to help these countries in Western and Eastern Europe recover economically following World War II, so that they would have no need to turn to communism for any money or funding that the Soviet Union might offer. So actually by 1953, so 6 years after the doctrine and plan were put in place, the USA had provided $17 billion of aid to rebuild economies, and Europe became more of a political battleground between East and West, and there was a clear division, as Churchill has stated in his Iron Curtain speech, which we looked at in the last episode. With this creation of the East and West, Stalin began to criticise the US more and accuse them of trying to dominate Europe and boost the US economy by doing so. But Stalin believed that the American intentions for intervening in Europe were only regarding their economy and to boost their own economy, and the Soviet Union branded the US as selfish and trying to be a bigger power than they should be in Europe, which is something that the US ironically criticised the Soviet Union of doing, and which the Soviet Union used back to respond to this growing influence that the US was starting to have in the continent. But it wasn't just a response that the Soviet Union gave, it was a verbal response. They gave physical responses as well. This came in the form of Cominform, which was actually called the Communist Information Bureau, and was set up in 1947 And basically it was the equivalent of the Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union started to promise countries in Eastern Europe that they would back them financially and politically, in terms of elections and things like that, and help sure that the communist parties there were empowered to make sure that the structures they wanted to progress into could be made. And with that structure of communism being implemented in those countries would therefore follow the Soviet Union in foreign policies against the US. So this idea of a barrier being created in between East and West Europe started to be made. And this was backed up once again by the equivalent to the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. So Comintern actually was the Truman Doctrine, and then Comintern was the Marshall Plan equivalent. It was called the Council for Mutual Assistance, founded in 1949. So this was a council which had lots of funding directed towards Eastern European countries, and they said once again they would financially support these countries. However, the difference between the Comintern and the Marshall Plan was that the Comintern was a council, and it had more intentions of dominating these East European economies and governments themselves and dictating their policies, whereas the Marshall Plan was merely a aid that the US gave to European countries, and not something designed to try and overwhelm the governments there in those countries to accept communism or capitalism. So this is where the difference lies, and from this, those slight differences in the ways that both countries are trying to outdo each other are starting to be realised. The US are maybe at this time just doing it for the mere purpose of helping other countries to develop, whereas the Soviet Union is helping other countries to develop, but for their own gain and for their own way of defending themselves if the US do get more powerful in Europe. So yeah, that's where the early tensions and the origins of the Cold War have developed into. It developed into these four different types of laws and legislation that was passed, well, briefly in 2 years' time apart. So, and then this leads very, very quickly onto the establishment of two treaties and two unions almost, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, which we'll look at probably, I think it's in the next episode. Yeah, briefly in the next episode, so we'll be looking at that. But yeah, that's it for today. If you did like the video, please leave a comment, subscribe down below, leave a like, and I'll probably see you tomorrow in episode 4, or if not, before that. Thank you for watching.